When it comes to the Zelda series, there is a question that has always divided the gaming community. Is The Legend of Zelda a role-playing game or not? The very first game on the NES even had its origins in the role-playing genre. This is the story of how The Legend of Zelda was transformed from a first-person, turn-based role-playing game to an action-adventure in the overworld perspective. In late 1984, Nintendo's family computer, or the Famicom, was the best-selling game console in Japan. However, the performance of the system was already reaching its limits at that time, as it was only designed to play a home port of Nintendo's arcade hit Donkey Kong as cheaply as possible. To future-proof the system and boost sales, a hardware add-on was to be released, the Famicom Disk System. Shigeru Miyamoto was commissioned to create a game that would demonstrate the strength of the new hardware. But Miyamoto also wanted to create a game that would serve as a swan song for the regular cartridge-based Famicom. This game was Super Mario Bros., which was released in Japan in September 1985. At the same time, Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka were also working on the game for the Famicom Disk System that was to become The Legend of Zelda. The earliest surviving sketches and designs for The Legend of Zelda are dated February 1st and 13th, 1985. These first production designs were kept in the same folder alongside similar documents for Super Mario Bros. This folder was called Mario Adventure or just Adventure. While Mario Adventure was conceived as a linear athletic game, Adventure was supposed to have an open world with non-linear progression and to use the more powerful hardware and storage capabilities of the disk system. Back then, Miyamoto was fascinated by the idea of so-called miniature garden games. The idea behind them was that every player should have a unique world within their game. He wanted the players to create their own little garden at home and to change it according to their own wishes. In retrospect, this sounds similar to Animal Crossing, where everyone can create their own little town or island. But at that time, Miyamoto thought that players should be able to change the game world and that these changes should be stored on the rewritable floppy disk. Later on, this idea was realized in the sense that the different dungeons could be completed in almost any order and that they remained completed. Also, heart containers and equipment hidden on the map could be collected and these changes would remain as well. From today's perspective, this seems almost trivial. But back then, progress in games on home consoles could only be saved with passwords, some of which were very long and cumbersome. Imagine playing a turn-based RPG and having to write down a 20-character password at the end of each gaming session and having to enter it again at the beginning of a new gaming session. This was actually still the case in 1986 with the very first Dragon Quest game. A built-in save function was not available until 1989 when Dragon Quest was released on the NES in the USA, where it was renamed to Dragon Warrior. Dragon Quest II from 1987 still required a password, which could be up to 52 characters long. At the time, passwords were also required for action RPGs on the Famicom, such as Highlight Special by TNE Soft or Walukyudo no Boken by Namco, which is also known as Adventure of the Valkyrie. Both games were released in Japan in 1986, as was The Legend of Zelda. In the Valkyrie adventure, for example, the level and status of the protagonist were saved. Most of the equipment, however, wasn't saved, and the dungeons were completely reset upon reloading. Hopefully these comparisons make it clear just how groundbreaking the save function and the idea of a persistent game world was back then. At least groundbreaking for games on home consoles. Back then, the progress in computer games could already be saved, for example in RPG series such as Ultima and Wizardry. These also had a great influence on the development of role-playing games in Japan. In both Ultima and Wizardry, you traverse dungeons drawn with wireframe models and fight monsters in turn-based battles. In Ultima there is also an overworld which is shown from an overhead perspective. Ultima 3 introduced tactical turn-based battles on a separate screen. If you replace the turn-based elements with a real-time combat system and limit all the action to one screen, you are not too far away from a game like The Legend of Zelda. and this is not surprising considering that Ultima was a source of inspiration for Miyamoto. Another source of inspiration was the Black Onyx, an RPG in the style of Wizardry developed by Henk Rogers in Japan. In Western countries, Henk Rogers is probably more well known for being the founder of Bulletproof Software and later the Tetris company. But before that, he had a huge success with the Black Onyx despite a rocky start upon its initial release. But it ultimately brought RPGs into the mainstream of the Japanese gaming scene and familiarized many future game developers with this style of game. One of them was Yuji Horii, who later created Dragon Quest and with it the blueprint for the JRPG genre as a whole. Ryoko Kodama was also influenced by the Black Onyx, which played a role in her creating the Phantasy Star series. So it should be clear that Shigeru Miyamoto was inspired by Western computer RPGs and that he wanted to create his own interpretation of these games. A central focus of his were the character progression and the combat system. Miyamoto liked the idea of a game character growing stronger over time and how this would create a true sense of pride and accomplishment for the players. After all, he heard of enthusiastic RPG players calling each other at night and bragging about their powerful heroes. To convey these ideas, the player avatar was supposed to grow stronger as the adventure progressed. However, Miyamoto simplified the complex system of abstract numbers. For example, he converted life points to hearts. This visual representation was immediately understandable to the players without having to juggle numbers. Furthermore, instead of strength or armor class, players could find 2 stronger swords and obtain 2 armor wings, each of which doubled the damage inflicted upon enemies or half the damage received from enemies. In this way, Zelda became accessible to a wider audience, especially children. There are no longer experience points, levels or status attributes that are usually associated with RPGs. Well, at least they do not exist in a traditional sense. As mentioned before, the hearts, swords and armor wings can be seen as a substitute for status attributes. Because even if the players aren't obviously confronted with numbers, the underlying game mechanics still work with numbers. The player avatar can have 3 hearts or even 16. After a successful boss battle, you earn a heart container, which sort of works like a level up. An attack from an opponent might steal a heart in the beginning. After the blue wing is acquired, only half a heart is lost, and with the red wing only a quarter heart is lost. Later opponents like Lionels, however, inflict 2 hearts of damage per hit because they have a higher strength attribute. Also, Link can deal double or triple damage after acquiring more powerful swords. In this way, The Legend of Zelda is still a parametric program, but it does not show the feature as obviously as a traditional RPG based on Dungeons & Dragons. Finally, Zelda differs in its combat system. While Miyamoto liked the character progression in RPGs, he didn't like the way that these games were played. They were slow and inaccessible, and the players didn't take an active role in the fights. They only gave commands and waited for the dice to roll, which determined whether an attack landed or not and how much damage it inflicted. In keeping with Miyamoto's previous inclination towards athletic and action-based games based on reflexes and motor skills, he transformed Zelda into an exciting game with a real-time combat system. From now on, it would depend on the player skill as to whether they would hit an enemy or not. Conversely, the player avatar would get hit if they were unable to dodge enemy attacks on the screen. This sounds almost trivial, but comparable action RPGs like Highlight or Ys do not require the players to swing their swords in the first place. The player avatar runs into opponents and the system calculates who is hit and how much damage is inflicted. This is a simplification and automation of battles like in the Dungeons & Dragons game, only that the computer can do the calculations instantly and the game appears as if it were in real time. Compared to this, Zelda is much more of a classic action game, where collision detection and hitboxes play a major role. This may just be a tiny nuance, but it's certainly part of the reason why many players still rave about The Legend of Zelda even today, while poor Highlight is still the subject of mockery and ridicule in Western gaming communities. It turns out that Zelda has taken a lot of inspiration from Western RPGs and that these games were stripped down to their core elements. but in Miyamoto's early sketches, it can be seen just how much the game was originally anchored in RPG traditions. In his very first design documents, the game was still shown from the first-person perspective. Apparently there was no overworld yet, only a choice between different dungeons. On his sketches, the way to the dungeon itself is shown as a mere line. Another line points to this one, and right next to it the dungeon symbol can be seen. The annotations say random and a box with a question mark is shown. This could be an indication of a random battle or a short random dungeon. From the dungeon entrance screen, the player can access one of 5 different floors, although the path to the 5th floor is initially blocked. First, you have to find one of 4 crystal balls on each of the first 4 floors and then insert them into a portrait of a dragon. Apparently there was some kind of boss on the 5th floor and puzzles in between. How exactly the dungeon itself or the perspective within it would have looked like, and whether Miyamoto had really considered a turn-based combat system is hard to say for certain. But given the similarities to computer RPGs so far, it might have been possible that The Legend of Zelda did indeed start out as a turn-based RPG. There were supposed to be 16 dungeons, the layout of which was meticulously planned in advance. Each dungeon was divided into individual rectangular rooms, and together they formed a certain pattern. These patterns were arranged in a 16 by 8 rectangle like a jigsaw puzzle. This was due to the limitation of the hardware and an economical way to offer as much content as possible while using as little memory as possible. Toshihige Nakago implemented the dungeons according to the sketches, but a grave mistake occurred. Each sketch featured 8 dungeons in an interlocked map, but Takashi Tezuka only submitted 1 sketch. As a result, only 8 dungeons were included in the game and 50% of the memory was still unused. So Miyamoto proposed to create a second quest with the remaining 8 dungeons. This means that one of the most innovative features of this game was nothing more than the product of a mishap and Miyamoto's creative solution. The overworld was created by Miyamoto and Tezuka after the dungeons were finished. They took a large piece of drawing paper and each designed one half of it. Tezuka designed the left half of the map while Miyamoto drew the right half. If you look closely, you can even see certain differences in the design. Tezuka's left half looks more orderly and maze-like, while Miyamoto's half contains many free spaces. In the beginning, he still used the permanent marker to draw many small dots for the individual trees, but eventually he lost patience and continued to only draw rough strokes. This may also explain why the middle of his half has a much more intricate design, whereas the outer parts are characterized by a long and fairly straightforward coastal line and mountain range. Before ending this video, I'd like to discuss the games that might have served as inspiration for the action-based combat system. In the early 80s, Japanese computer game developers were already experimenting with action combat systems that were partly inspired by turn-based RPG combat. One of the most influential games from this early phase has even been mentioned before: Highlight. Together with Dragon Slayer and Mugen no Shinso, it belongs to the 3 national treasures of RPGs. That is to say, 3 particularly influential role-playing games created by Japanese developers. Highlight was developed by TNE Soft and published on the NEC PC-88 in December 1984. It offered an open world, several dungeons and a few puzzles. By defeating enemies you collect experience points and gain levels. Certain items must be collected to unlock new areas and complete the quest. All of this sounds very similar to The Legend of Zelda, although in a simplified form. However, it needs to be stated that Highlight was released 14 months before Zelda, and that this time difference between releases was much more significant back then. And by the time Highlight was released on the NES in the West, 5 years had already passed since its original release, which is why Highlight seems so terribly outdated. Another very influential game from around that time period was the Tower of Tuaraga, an arcade game published by Namco in July 1984. The Tower of Tuaraga was designed as a fantasy Pac-Man and combined elements of dungeon crawler RPGs with arcade games. Each of the 60 floors of the tower looks like an oversized labyrinth from Pac-Man. However, the player does not necessarily have to flee from enemies because it is possible to fight back. With the push of a button, the protagonist, called Gil, can extend his sword and attack enemies in front of him. Meanwhile, he moves his shield to the side, which allows him to block certain ranged attacks coming from the side. There are also numerous secrets to reveal which grant useful items. Although not all of these are essential for completing the game, they can make the game much easier. The conditions for obtaining hidden items may be relatively simple at the beginning of the adventure, like defeating a certain number of enemies. But these conditions become increasingly complex and obscure. This has led to some Japanese players exchanging tips about how to get certain items and progress further. Miyamoto wanted to reproduce this cooperative gaming experience. This is why The Legend of Zelda does not have a high score display, even though it was designed at the same time as Super Mario Bros. After all, it was less about comparing pure skill like in a regular arcade or video game, and more about exploring the miniature garden and solving the many puzzles together. A hint regarding the Tower of Tuaraga being a possible inspiration for The Legend of Zelda can be found in some common enemies. For example, in Tuaraga there are wizards that resemble the Wizardry from Zelda, both in behavior and appearance. They show up at random places on the dungeon floor and send a spell towards the hero. Furthermore, there are knights in Tuaraga that resemble the Dark Knights from Zelda, with the main difference being a slightly more complex AI. Another noteworthy feature of The Legend of Zelda is that it uses a scenario that is atypical for Nintendo, namely high fantasy, which is often used in RPGs. The setting was a contribution by Takashi Tezuka, who was influenced by Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Thus, he brought Western fantasy elements into the game, like epic conflicts between good and evil or mystical artifacts like the Triforce. Even the NPCs with their cryptic clues or prophecies seem as if they were derived from a fantasy novel. All in all, it cannot be denied that The Legend of Zelda had its origins in the realms and genre conventions of role-playing games. In Zelda 2, Miyamoto and his team added even more obvious RPG elements into the series, before quickly discarding them with A Link to the Past. But if it wasn't for Miyamoto's and Tezuka's short liaison with the role-playing genre, Zelda might not exist in the form we know today. And thanks to their fresh ideas, they have created a successful template for a genre that is still thriving today.